the vast, wind-swept Eurasian steppes. This was the world of the Huns, a nomadic people whose lives were a constant rhythm of movement. They roamed endless plains where survival wasn't a given. It was earned through incredible skill, superhuman endurance, and a legendary mastery of horseback riding. Imagine this: no cities, no walls, no borders to defend. Their home was the horizon, their lives defined by the thunder of hooves and the spirit of unpredictability. To the settled civilizations of the time, they were a force of nature. Roman historians wrote with a mix of awe and terror, describing a people who could appear from nowhere, strike like lightning, and then vanish back into the grasslands without a trace. They weren't just warriors, they were ghosts on horseback, a mystery that shook the foundations of the ancient world. Imagine a force of nature, a storm on horseback that swept across continents before anyone even knew it was coming. That was the Huns. They didn't knock on the gates of empires. They simply appeared, a whirlwind of arrows and thunderous hooves. They weren't interested in building new kingdoms or ruling over cities. Their empire was the saddle, their domain, the vast open plains. They moved with a speed that defied logic, striking deep into the heart of Roman and Germanic territories, then vanishing as quickly as they came. Their goal wasn't just conquest, it was chaos. They sowed fear so effectively that their very name became a whisper of doom. The Huns didn't just change the map of the ancient world, they redrew it in fire and terror, forcing entire peoples to flee and reshaping the destiny of Europe forever. Imagine a name so feared that entire regions would tremble just at the rumor of their approach. That was the reality of the Huns. We're not just talking about a powerful army, we're talking about a force that changed the very landscape of war. When the Huns were on the move, villages and towns had two choices: flee for your lives or desperately try to fortify yourselves, knowing it was likely futile. What made them so terrifying wasn't just their skill in battle, which was legendary. It was their mastery of psychological warfare. The Huns didn't just fight on the battlefield. They controlled it long before the first arrow was loosed. Their reputation, their speed, and their sheer unpredictability were weapons in themselves. This was the absolute peak of steppe warfare, an art form of total domination. They didn't just conquer lands, they conquered the minds of their enemies. Imagine a world of endless grass, stretching to the horizon under a vast, unforgiving sky. This was the birthplace of the Huns, the harsh steppes of Central Asia. Here, there were no cities, no walls to hide behind. The vast open plains demanded resilience and skill, where only the strongest survived. From sunrise to sunset, they lived in the saddle, becoming one with their horses. They weren't just riding, they were mastering the art of the bow on horseback, turning themselves into the most feared mobile archers of their time. This wasn't just training for a battle, it was training for a life of constant movement, a life of conquest. The ground shook with the thunder of their hooves, a sound that would soon echo across empires and change the course of history forever. Forget everything you think you know about how the Huns changed the world. It wasn't just about epic battles or conquering cities. The real story started long before they ever faced a Roman legion. Imagine a massive, unstoppable force moving west across the steppes. This was the Hunnic migration. They weren't just wandering aimlessly. This was a strategic advance. With every mile they covered, they pushed other tribes, Goths, Vandals, Alans out of their homelands. These displaced peoples then flooded toward the Roman Empire's borders, not as invaders, but as desperate refugees. This domino effect completely destabilized the region, redrawing the map of Europe before a single major battle was even fought. It was a chain reaction of survival and conquest that reshaped history itself. Have you ever heard of a force so powerful it redrew the map of an entire continent? That was the Huns. We're not just talking about a group of warriors. We're talking about a human storm that swept across Eurasia. Their movement wasn't just a series of battles. It was a cataclysm that completely destabilized ancient kingdoms. Imagine established empires, secure in their power, suddenly facing a threat they couldn't predict or comprehend. Trade routes that had existed for centuries were shattered, and economies were thrown into chaos. In the face of this unstoppable force, old enemies had to become new friends, forging alliances that would have been unthinkable just years before. The Huns weren't just conquerors. They were a phenomenon that changed the course of history forever. Imagine a world where a child learns to ride a horse before they can even walk properly. This wasn't a myth, it was the reality for the Huns. From the moment they were born, the saddle was their second home. At a tender age, while other kids were playing with toys, Hunnic children were mastering the art of archery. Not from a standstill, but while galloping at full speed. Think about that skill, that incredible coordination. Every adult was a seasoned warrior, and every horse was an extension of their will, a weapon of war. This wasn't just a tribe, it was a storm on horseback, a force of nature that would reshape continents. Their training wasn't just practice, it was a way of life that forged the most feared cavalry in history. Imagine a force that swept across Europe, seemingly from nowhere. They were the Huns. Unlike the heavily armored legions of Rome or the fortified castles of their enemies, the Huns had a different kind of strength. Their power wasn't in steel or stone, but in speed, skill, and the saddle. Raised as nomads on the vast steppes, they were warriors forged by a life in constant motion. This gave them an unmatched advantage. They could appear on the horizon, unleash a storm of arrows from their powerful bows, disappear before their foes even had time to draw their swords. Their mobility was their greatest weapon, allowing them to strike with devastating surprise and then vanish like ghosts, leaving confusion and fear in their wake. They didn't just conquer lands, they redefined the very nature of warfare. When you think of the Huns, what's the first image that comes to mind? A chaotic, thundering horde, right? But what if I told you that was completely wrong? The Huns were anything but chaotic. Their entire society was a masterclass in readiness, endurance, and adaptability. Think about it. Every single movement, every raid, every long march was meticulously calculated. They didn't just stumble into victory. They engineered it. They were precise masters of unpredictability, turning what seemed like chaos to their enemies into a perfectly executed symphony of warfare. It wasn't about brute force alone. It was about strategy, discipline, and a deep understanding of their environment. The true strength of the Huns wasn't just their fierceness, but the brilliant, calculated mind behind the storm. Ever wondered how the Huns became one of history's most feared forces? It wasn't through epic, drawn-out battles like you see in the movies. Their genius was in a completely different style of warfare. Imagine this. A massive, thundering force appears on the horizon, attacks with shocking speed and ferocity, and then vanishes. Just like that. Before their enemies could even regroup, the Huns would reappear from a totally unexpected direction, striking again where they were least anticipated. They were masters of psychological warfare. One of their favorite tricks was the feigned retreat. They'd pretend to flee in chaos, luring entire armies to chase them, only to lead them straight into a deadly, perfectly laid trap. It was this unpredictable, ghost-like strategy that made them so terrifyingly effective. Ever wondered how a nomadic force could terrify mighty empires? The secret wasn't brute strength, but lightning-fast tactics. The Huns were masters of the hit-and-run, a whirlwind on horseback that left enemies bewildered. They never stood for a pitched battle. Instead, they would swarm in, unleashing a storm of arrows from their powerful composite bows, only to vanish as quickly as they appeared. Imagine facing this ghost army. You'd brace for a charge, and they'd melt away. You'd think you'd won, only to have them reappear on your flank, raining destruction. Their most infamous trick? The feigned retreat. They'd pretend to flee in chaos, luring confident armies into a reckless pursuit. Then, once the trap was sprung, they would turn, encircle, and annihilate their overextended foes. It was a terrifyingly effective strategy that made them one of history's most feared forces. It wasn't by fighting like everyone else. Forget long, drawn-out battles with soldiers lined up in neat rows. The Huns were masters of hit-and-run warfare. They were ghosts on the battlefield. One moment, they'd unleash a storm of arrows, striking with terrifying speed and precision. The next, they would simply vanish, melting back into the landscape before their enemy could even react. Then, just when their opponents thought it was safe, the Huns would reappear from a completely different direction, striking again where they were least expected. They even perfected the feigned retreat, luring entire armies into carefully laid traps. This unpredictable psychological style of combat shattered enemy morale and made the Huns seem like an unstoppable force of nature.
Ever wonder what made the Huns so terrifying? It wasn't just their numbers or their weapons. It was something far more powerful: fear. Imagine you're a Roman legionary standing in your disciplined formation, shield locked with your comrades. You're the backbone of the mightiest empire on earth. Suddenly, the ground trembles. On the horizon, a storm of horsemen appears, moving like the wind.
They don't charge into your spears. Instead, they circle, unleashing a relentless hail of arrows from horseback, picking your ranks apart from a distance. Your formations, designed for close combat, are slow and useless against this whirlwind of death. The Huns didn't just fight wars. They rewrote the rules of engagement, turning sheer panic into their deadliest weapon. This mobile, psychological warfare is what brought an empire to its knees. Have you ever wondered how a smaller force could consistently dominate a much larger one? Let's talk about the Huns. They weren't just warriors, they were masters of strategy. Their secret weapon wasn't just their legendary archery, but a terrifying combination of speed, surprise, and psychological warfare. Imagine this: a storm of horsemen appearing seemingly out of nowhere, striking hard and fast, then vanishing before you can even mount a defense. They turned every battle into a lesson in movement and terror. Instead of engaging in head-on clashes, they'd harass, encircle, and wear down their enemies, creating an atmosphere of constant fear and uncertainty. They didn't just defeat armies, they broke their spirit. This tactical genius allowed them to build one of history's most feared empires. Picture the late Roman Empire, a titan of its time, suddenly facing a storm from the east. This wasn't just another rival army. It was the Huns. Their relentless westward march wasn't just a series of raids. They were a force of nature, pushing entire tribes like the Goths and Vandals right into Roman territory. This massive influx of refugees and warriors began to crack the foundations of the empire, creating chaos and instability along the borders. The Romans, masters of disciplined warfare, marched in their famous formations, their legions a symbol of order and power. They trusted their training in steel. But how do you fight a whirlwind? The Huns were unlike anything they had ever faced. They moved like shadows on the vast plains, striking with lightning speed and devastating accuracy. Fear. It's an ancient weapon, and few wielded it as masterfully as the Huns. Long before their cavalry thundered over the horizon, a wave of pure terror washed over the land. Imagine being a villager, hearing whispers carried on the wind rumors of an unstoppable force. A storm of men that devoured everything in its path. These weren't just stories. The Huns' raids were legendary for their speed and ferocity. They were a phantom menace, striking without warning and vanishing just as quickly. Traditional armies, accustomed to set-piece battles and fortified lines, were utterly bewildered. How do you fight an enemy that doesn't play by the rules? You can't build a wall high enough to stop a ghost. For many, surrender seemed the only option, as the very name Hun became synonymous with impending doom. Imagine you're a Roman general, confident in your legions, the unstoppable force that conquered the world. Your formations are perfect, your discipline unmatched. Then from the steppes, a storm appears on the horizon. It's not a storm of weather, but of men on horseback. The Huns. At first, you might dismiss them as disorganized barbarians. Fatal mistake. Roman generals consistently underestimated the Huns, and they paid a heavy price. They learned, often too late, that sheer mobility and terrifying surprise could shatter even the most disciplined infantry formations. The Huns didn't fight like anyone the Romans had faced before. They were a whirlwind of arrows, feigned retreats, and sudden, devastating charges. They forced the Roman Empire, the masters of war, to completely rethink their strategies and even adapt their own armies. The Huns didn't just raid the empire. They changed the very nature of warfare itself. He was known as the Scourge of God, a name that struck fear into the hearts of emperors and kings. This is the story of Attila, the most formidable leader of the Huns. In the 5th century, a storm was gathering on the steppes of Central Asia. The Huns, a nomadic people of incredible warriors, were fractured and scattered. That is until Attila rose to power. He didn't just lead, he united. With a strategic mind and unmatched brutality, he forged the disparate Hunnic tribes into a single, unstoppable force. From the Danube to the Rhine, his campaigns cut a swath across Europe. He sacked cities, held empires for ransom, and his presence alone was enough to make legions tremble. He wasn't just a warlord. He was a force of nature that reshaped the ancient world. Forget the myths and legends you think you know. Let's talk about the real Attila the Hun. This wasn't just some barbarian brute. He was one of history's most brilliant and fearsome strategists. Imagine a leader so effective that he transformed scattered nomadic tribes into a unified, unstoppable army. Under his command, the Huns became a military machine that made entire kingdoms, even the mighty Roman Empire, tremble in fear. They didn't just call him a king. The Romans had a special name for him, the Scourge of God. They believed he was a divine punishment sent to wreak havoc upon the world. How did one man build such a terrifying reputation and an empire that stretched across continents? The story of Attila is more than just battles. It's a masterclass in power, strategy, and fear. Have you ever heard of the empire that terrified both Rome and Persia, built entirely on horseback? Let's talk about the Huns and their legendary leader Attila. Forged in the harsh steppes of Central Asia, the Huns were masters of mounted archery. Imagine thousands of warriors thundering across the plains, showering their enemies with arrows before they could even react. This wasn't just brute force. Attila, known as the Scourge of God, was a brilliant strategist. He leveraged speed, intelligence, and psychological warfare, striking where least expected. His campaigns demonstrated the deadly power of a nomadic empire on horseback, reshaping the map of Europe and leaving a legacy that echoed for centuries. Who do you think was the most formidable leader in ancient history? Have you ever wondered what happened to the Huns after Attila the Hun, the Scourge of God, died? Well, it's a fascinating story of how a mighty empire can vanish almost overnight. In 453 AD, Attila died unexpectedly on his wedding night. His sons, who inherited the empire, immediately started fighting each other for control. This internal conflict was the beginning of the end. The Germanic tribes that the Huns had conquered saw their chance. They rose up in a massive rebellion. In the decisive Battle of Nada in 454 AD, a coalition of Germanic peoples crushed the Hunnic forces. Without Attila's genius to unite them, the Hunnic Confederation simply disintegrated. The remaining Huns scattered, some assimilating into other cultures, others fading back into the vast Eurasian steppes. Their once terrifying empire vanished from history, but their legacy as fearsome warriors lived on for centuries. Have you ever heard of a people so fierce their very name became a synonym for terror? That was the Huns. They didn't just appear on the world stage. Exploded onto it, a nomadic storm from the vast Eurasian steppes. For centuries, their story became legend, inspiring fear long after their empire vanished. But the Huns didn't just fight battles, they rewrote the rules of war. Riding their swift horses, they were masters of the hit-and-run attack, firing deadly composite bows with unmatched skill. They seemed unstoppable, a force of nature that brought powerful empires to their knees. Their impact was so profound that they didn't just win wars. They reshaped the very map of the ancient world. They were more than conquerors. They were a catalyst for change, a whirlwind that left a permanent mark on history. Have you ever wondered about the force that terrified both the Roman and Chinese empires? I'm talking about the Huns. Forget what you know about traditional empire builders. The Huns didn't waste time constructing grand cities or managing vast territories. Their empire was the open steppe, and their power was pure, relentless motion. Imagine this: a storm of horsemen appearing on the horizon, so fast they seemed to blur. They were masters of the mounted bow, raining arrows on their enemies before they could even react. They didn't conquer cities in the traditional sense. They shattered them. They broke armies, dissolved borders, and instilled a level of fear that echoed for centuries. The Huns weren't just warriors. They were a force of nature that completely rewrote the rules of warfare. History doesn't remember the Huns for the empires they built, but for the ones they shattered. They weren't just warriors. They were a storm, a relentless force of nature sweeping across the land. Imagine a people whose very name struck fear into the hearts of the mightiest civilizations. From the vast, open plains of the steppe, they emerged as masters of horseback warfare, a whirlwind of arrows and hooves that seemed unstoppable. They didn't come to conquer and rule in the traditional sense. Instead, They rode as a lesson in chaos, a stark reminder of the raw, tamed power lurking beyond the borders of the known world. The Huns were the ultimate disruptors, a testament to how a nomadic force could change the course of history forever. What do you think was their most lasting impact? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into history's most fascinating stories.